Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like first to thank the New Books in the Arts and Humanities series and the SOF Heyman Center and Lindsay for organizing everything as well as she does. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. It is wonderful and delightful to celebrate Eleanor Johnson's incredible book, Waste and the Wasters, Poetry and Ecosystemic Thought in Medieval England. My name is Denise Cruz, and I am the chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature. I'm here primarily to introduce this panel of excellent scholars, but I also want to extend my congratulations to Eleanor Johnson. This book, you should all buy it, uncovers relations and forms of connection between the living and the non-living, the natural world and the social, our contemporary moment and medieval cultures, tracing ecosystemic modes of thought and poetics in Johnson's characteristically brilliant readings. I know we're all excited to hear from her and from the panelists. Eleanor Johnson is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, and she specializes in late medieval English prose, poetry and drama, medieval poetics and literary philosophy, law and literature in the Middle Ages, vernacular theology, and most recently, horror. She's the author of 2 books. Waste and the Wasters is her third. Jack Halberstam is the David Feinstein Professor of the Humanities and Director of Columbia's Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender. He's written 7 books, including The Queer Art of Failure, and most recently, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Brooke Holmes is the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Classics at Princeton. Her scholarly pursuits center on the history and philosophy of concepts, particularly focusing on the behavior of concepts surrounding the physical body, nature, and life within ancient Greek and Roman textual sources. Her research underscores the complexity of these concepts pose in attempts to theorize subjects and forms of ethical and political agency. Eliza Zingasser is an associate professor of French at Columbia University. Her current book, or her most recent book, was Stolen Song, How the Troubadours Became French, and it was published by Cornell in 2020. She's a specialist of medieval French and Occitan literature, and her current project is about the way birds mediate eroticism in medieval literature. Thank you so much. And Eleanor, will you start us off? Please join us in welcoming Eleanor and the channel.
Hello. Hello at home, people. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks to the Society Fellows and the Heyman Center. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, students. Thank you, colleagues. I'm very happy to see everybody here. This is a delightful moment, partially because I worked on this book for 19 years. And now it doesn't just live here, it lives here. And that makes me feel like I have a whole lot of free memory in my mind to go do other things with my life. But I'm very happy to be here and talking about this book. And I thought that I would start by kind of giving, sorry, I have to be close to the mic, giving kind of an evolutionary history of the ideas in the book. So as every one of my students in this room would tell you, I often say that the best ideas start with a really small observation. And the really small observation that started this book was the following. It is weird that William Langland, who is the crankiest poet of the entire 14th century, decides to make his arch villain this random allegorical personification called Waster. He could have picked Satan. That would be obvious. He could have picked lechery. That might make sense. He could have picked greed. He really does hate greedy people too. But Waster is like his bête noire. He can't let it go. So I thought, why Waster? What's at stake in that? Why does he want to villainize Waster so much? What even is Waster? And I should pause and point out that, Waster obviously is an allegorical personification. And allegorical personification, although not like the trendiest poetic mode these days, does a lot of work for people, right? Generally speaking, in history, poets make personifications out of concepts that refuse to sit still. They refuse to be subjected to like rational, organized, logical discourse. So what do? You take the concept and you literally turn it into a person so that you can have different other concepts, talk to it, and figure it out. You basically make it a social organism. So the move to personify waste really like sparked something in my mind. So I said, okay, Langland, you've done this thing. I'm going to go find other wasters in medieval literature. So I went on like a reading tour. And I found that there's this other poem, probably a source for Langland, actually, in 1352 called Winner and Waster, that also has this personification named Waster. And I thought, great, surely Langland's Waster and Winner and Waster's Waster will do similar stuff. Mais non, because the reality is that medieval poets are not totally clear on what they're talking about when they talk about waste. It is a term with tremendous elasticity in the period that can signify a whole bunch of different things. So to pause on that for a second, waste does not mean in the Middle Ages the most common thing it means now, which is the noun of unwanted material byproduct, right? It doesn't mean garbage. It doesn't mean trash. It doesn't mean shit. It doesn't mean anything like that. When waste appears in medieval culture and medieval literature, it's most commonly a verb. When it's a noun, it specifically means the wastelands. That's the nominal sense in which you get waste in this period, which I didn't know prior to asking my little question of the cranky poet, William Langland. When waste is a verb in these poems, it tends to mean like a surprisingly paradoxical and self-contradictory array of things. Waste most commonly means to radically overuse something, like to waste food. And it doesn't mean what it means now, to let food go to waste. It means to eat all the food up. Waste is about overconsumption. It is also emergently in the 14th century about underconsumption. So the meaning of waste in an active sense is it originally derives from like how we say now to lay waste to something, when you like overconsume, 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 and then what you leave behind is a wasted space, right? Like in Latin, a vastitas, a wasted thing. Over the course of the 14th century, waste takes on as a verb in English an increasingly passivated force, so that people do start to say like such and such a thing goes to waste, or such and such a thing is wasted. And so waste means in the 14th century both like a gross problematic overuse of a resource and a gross problematic underuse of a resource. So I thought, that's interesting. And then I started to ask like, okay, so what are the objects of waste? What are the wastable things in the, imaginations of these poems? And I started to notice that in Winter and Waster and in Piers Plowman, the thing that is most commonly wasted is the land. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna have to get into some property law now, which embarrassingly was a source of tremendous excitement for me because I happen to really like medieval property law. So I went and spent a long time reading medieval property law, which like you should try. Case laws are fascinating. Medieval property case laws are fascinating because you have what some legal historians call learned lay litigants. So people who are not lawyers, but whose lives are meaningfully impacted by their ability to manipulate their land and their resources, coming into court and saying like, hey, this is a problem. And the judges say, sure it is, but we don't really know how to deal with it. And the case law around waste works very much that way. So you have people saying, this person laid waste to my land and it's a problem and I want to prosecute them. And the courts are like, how are we going to bring that about? And so there's a whole series of statutes that get promulgated kind of in lockstep with this case law between 1215, which is Magna Carta, fairly famous body of law there. And one of the laws, there's chapters in there is about waste. From Magna Carta in 1215 to the so-called Statute of Waste in 1292. So over the course of the 13th century, a coherent body of positive law, which is to say like statutory law, gets enacted around waste. And if you read through all of that statutory material, what you learn is that the legal definition of waste is under a tremendous amount of pressure in this period, and it plays out in the ways that the poets talk about the act of waste. Specifically, over the course of this period of time, legal writers and lawyers and judges understand waste at first as any act of the proxy misuse of somebody else's land that you legally hold temporarily. I'll say that again. So like if Sarah owns property high and I'm renting it and I do something to the land that harms her ability to profit in the future, that's waste. So it's a despoliative overuse of something that belongs to someone else. In that idea is an implicit seed crystal of ecosystemic thought. The idea that what I do today with what's mine in the interim will affect Sarah's ability to thrive and profit and farm later on. I know you do. I see that. That's, an ecosystemic idea. And as the law evolves over the 13th century, the situations in which you can prosecute for people for waste get broader and broader. So initially it has to be Sarah owns the land, I'm renting the land. If I lay waste to it, she can sue me. By the end of the 13th century, anyone can sue anybody else for misusing land that they have an interest in. And you can recuperate monetary compensation for the land, which essentially means land value is getting monetized. That's due. You can basically say to people that the reason you should be allowed to sue them for waste isn't because your interest in the land has been harmed, but because someone many generations down from you, that's called a future interest, might be harmed. So the way the law is willing to understand my personal action in property as impinging on a collectivity over time is getting theorized, articulated, and legislated in this body of law. The poets of Winter and Waster and Piers Plowman, William Langland, they pick that idea up and they run with it because they come to understand that Waster, this character, is first and foremost someone who misuses the land in a way that hurts everybody else around them. But that's not the only discourse that matters to these poets. And I realized there was this kind of residual extra in the way these poets were thinking about waste that wasn't accounted for by the legal stuff. So I went and started reading penitential manuals, sermons, biblical discourse, surgical discourse, medical discourse, all sorts of stuff. And essentially what I learned is there's this countervailing secondary meaning of waste, which I alluded to before in the kind of letting things go to waste, which originates mostly in penitential literature, which is the literature of how you kind of absolve yourself of sin. And in that literature, there's a pervasive fixation on the idea that you can waste not just property, physical, like legal land, but you can waste yourself. And specifically, you waste yourself by wasting your words, by wasting your thoughts, by wasting your ideas, your energy, your intentions. So waste becomes a sin, not just a crime and property, but a sin in the ways you misuse your own resources of your internal landscape. And I thought, that's it. That's the interesting thing that these poets are seeing. They're seeing that this term waste is this kind of like galvanizing tool for them to think through how a person's misuse of material resources might impact a collectivity and how a person's misuse of their own soul might also negatively impact a collectivity. Because one of the things that these poets of waste understand very clearly is that it's a fantasy to believe that what I do with what I think of as really mine, my words, my time, my wits, my intentions, it's a fantasy for me to think that those don't impinge on all of you, not just in how you think and feel and intend, but in your bottom line, like how your material life actually works. And I thought, okay, I understand what's going on in these two poems. And then I started reading a lot of other poems that also speak to waste in one way or another. And that is kind of how this book was born. And I'm going to stop myself there, having given you kind of an outline of the early evolution of this book. And I will pass the torch. Okay.
Okay, I cannot do such a beautiful. Oh, sorry.
Oh, here.
Extemporaneous performance. So I'll read so I can keep to time, but let me start by saying what a huge pleasure and an honor it is to have the opportunity to celebrate the publication of Eleanor's extraordinary and powerful book, Waste and the Wasters, Poetry and Ecosystemic Thought in Medieval England. I've learned an enormous amount from this book, and I've also had the great good fortune to have been in conversation with Eleanor as she was working on the book. So it's a great chance to celebrate with her. Over the course of our conversations, I was working on a book I am still working on the concept of sympathy or sympatheia in the pre-modern Mediterranean from about the 4th century BCE to the 3rd century CE. And a significant part of this book is concerned with what Eleanor calls ecosystemic thought, and her use of that term made me rethink what I'm doing. Eleanor defines ecosystem at the start of Waste and the Wasters through the Greek word oikos, which means house or household, and the Greek word systema, which means a whole composed of several parts or members. So when we use this word ecosystem, she writes, quote, "We are talking about the world we live in as a household. And we are thinking about that household as an organized collection of interconnected parts." So Eleanor's appeal to the ecosystemic is deeply resonant with ancient Greek concepts of cosmological sympathy, sympatheia. And it's no doubt in part because of these resonances that I was asked to join this panel. At any rate, this is the expertise I have. I don't know very much about medieval English poetry. In the text that I work with, sympathy is most fully expressed by thinking about the world as a living organism with interconnected parts, and the kind of locus classicus for this idea is Plato's Timaeus. It can also be expressed through networks of astrological sympathy that start to emerge in the Hellenistic period, the last centuries BCE, at the convergence of late Babylonian celestial science, Greek cosmology, and the reception of both these traditions in first century BCE Rome. And these frameworks, both cosmobiological and astrological, converge in the 3rd century CE Neoplatonist, or we call him a Neoplatonist, he was just a Platonist, Plotinus of Alexandria. And so especially in his reception of Plato's Timaeus, Plotinus is very much an ecosystemic thinker in the way that Eleanor defines it. I know that Eleanor has worked a lot on Boethius, so in another context where I may have been more appropriately chosen for this panel, we could have talked about the reception of Neoplatonism and ecology. But what seems important in this context is that neither Plotinus nor earlier thinkers writing in Greek ever used the word ecosystem. The term is first used, rather, as Eleanor observes in the book's first sentence, in 1935 as, quote, "a way of talking about the natural world is broken down into systems of exchange, material transfer of resources between living and non-living things." So in 1935, you have these two Greek words, oikos and systema, put together into a neologism. What that means is ecosystem expresses a new moment in an expansive reception of ideas developing over millennia about community and a system of living and non-living things. So what I would emphasize from my perspective is that the Greekness of ecosystem does signal a long tradition of reading and rereading texts written in Greek and Latin that are organized around nature as a community of natures, and that crosses through the centuries in Waste and the Wasters. But the making of ecosystem as a neologism in 1935 also points to a constant, wild inventiveness within ways of imagining a world governed by nature, a natural world. So I emphasize these points because what seems to me crucial about Eleanor's use of ecosystemic in her opening pages is that she's herself using this term as at once historical and theoretical, as a historical and a theoretical lens. So she's using it to reshape, on the one hand, how we read poetry from late medieval England. On the other hand, she's using it to reshape how we use these texts to think through our contemporary ecosystemic crisis. That is, ecosystemic in her work with it does an important labor in her productive movement between a pre-modern past and the contemporary present. So Waste and the Wasters is both a literary and a historical work. It's glittering with Eleanor's brilliance as a reader of poetry and her deep erudition as a scholar. But I would argue it's also a significant theoretical contribution to how we inhabit ecosystemic thinking right now through untimely encounters with a pre-modern past. So Eleanor herself chooses the term ecosystemic to emphasize ideas of, quote, complexly interrelating and interconnected living and non-living things in a kind of household. And she goes on to say, ecosystemic for me articulates more vividly than ecological or environmental how utterly bound together the natural and the social world are, how mutually constitutive of they are, how indeed they organize each other, and how each plays a role in the habitability of Earth as an organized system, end quote. So Eleanor, I want to emphasize, claims ecosystem as a term on her own terms. And she claims it as a translation, I would say, of a word that is neither ancient Greek nor fully modern, namely waste, the word that's at the center of her reading of late medieval English texts, especially poetry. So in this way, she creates a new relationship between past and present that centers a particularly materially situated moment in late medieval England to reanimate lost layers of the contemporary ecosystemic imagination that's at once in line with the idea of nature and different from it. So I want to really emphasize that I think the book makes a powerful and a beautiful case for the belief that Eleanor articulates in the introduction, quote, understanding the eco-philosophies of earlier eras can only hone and sharpen our own. So I learned an enormous amount from this book as someone living through climate crisis and trying to bring pre-modern thought to bear on that crisis in my own way. Another reason that I learned so much from this book is because I'm a Hellenist, and as I said, I didn't know anything about the text that she centers in the book. And so I'm going to close, I want to not take up too much time, by focusing on one point that seemed to me really different from the material that I work on, and then a point that seems a sympathetic resonance. So I found it especially striking how much talk of waste comes out of readings of the Bible, and especially discussions of land and property in the Old Testament. And at the same time, Eleanor emphasizes in that chapter 2, I think it is, how much that late antique and early medieval commentators on the Bible, such as Augustine, are homing in on the wasting of immaterial goods and the soul in particular. So both these ideas, the land and the soul, are coming out of the Bible and biblical commentary. But it seems to me that those discourses meet with particular intensity because of the material scarcity of land in late medieval England and the crisis of the commons. Mm-hmm. So one of the great virtues of Waste and the Wasters is how deftly Eleanor weaves together material history, legal history, penitentiary texts, and poetry. And so this is one thing I wanted to emphasize. But this stress on the land and the resources of this small island of England in a very kind of lived way resonated for me, especially powerfully as we collectively grapple with our own awareness of the limits on Earth's resources and the planet's finitude. So I wondered whether Eleanor might say more about how the material dimensions of the crisis of the commons in her reading of Waste shed light on the question of the commons today, and her insights into the spiritual dimension of that question that you mentioned in the afterward. So there's something about the really embodied nature of your text that matters, but that's also, I think, resonant today. And so second, and then finally, and I'll finish with this, I was particularly intrigued by the chapter on Chaucer's Alchemist, the Canon's Yeoman. With the Alchemist, we move away from the land and agriculture to the city, the wasting body. And here's, I think, where you see natural science emerge most vividly in the text as a site for thinking about contagion and pollution. This is the material that feels most familiar to me because it's where you have medieval scientists and learned physicians talking about contagion and discourses of contagion as a corruption of air. And this idea of corrupted air has a long tradition in the learned Greek medical tradition, surfaces in Byzantine authors, as well as in Ibn Sina's canon. And I could talk more, I don't have time, about the relationship between contagio in Latin as a translation of sympatheia. So there's a close connection between sympatheia as cosmological and contagion in that, that body of thought. The only thing I want to do, given that I'm out of time, is to invite Eleanor to talk a little bit more about, in the book, the shift from the agricultural setting of those first 2 chapters on Langland and the winner, the waster and the winner, to alchemical waste. And there's a specific dynamics in that chapter that I wanted to hear you talk more about, that's about the affective matrix between the alchemist and the poet as they manage and mismanage elements and words. So there's something about the way elements emerge in that chapter that sheds light on what you're talking about poetry as material and how poetry participates in these ecosystemic complexes. But let me close by expressing my great admiration for the alchemy of Waste and the Wasters and the way Eleanor uses language to read old poetry anew in a way that makes us see, as she says, Earth is the element we all end up as. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel and getting me to think with this book. I am unburdened by any special knowledges that pertain to the period of the text under consideration and so on. So I'm just going to sort of trot through the material and make some observations that you know, I hope might not be too eccentric, but I really do want to stress that this actually is a book for the general reader. It probably doesn't matter because you're probably all medievalists or something. But you could pick this book up in an airport or in a really good bookshop, and you could read it on the plane and be like, oh my God, this is fantastic. It's funny, it's erudite, it wears its knowledge very lightly. It really gives insight into these systems that are very different from our own, but that inform them in ways that remain invisible without this kind of investigation. So just to give you my punchline, I'm going to be rooting for the waster. Okay. So Waste and the Wasters is an elegant, spare, and utterly compelling study of medieval eco-critical thought. Sticking a pin in the ballooning archive of works that date the Anthropocene to various singular moments in modern Euro-American histories and philosophies, the steam engine, colonial expansion, the Enlightenment, and so on, Eleanor, with utter clarity and total mastery of her materials, offers a different historical model for the emergence of ecological crisis and for an alternative understanding of that crisis and the potential solutions to it. She locates in medieval poetry a braided, complex set of responses to ecological crisis, to shifts in legal formulations of land use, and to the evolution of religious notions of waste that then transform into social perspectives on laziness and greediness. So as the title of the book proposes, the medieval concept of waste and its biblical antecedent, vestare, lie at the very heart of this palimpsestic model of ecosystemic crisis that emerges in the Middle Ages. And she points us to 5 particular waves of disaster that Middle Ages were beset by in the form of land shortage, climate change, food scarcity, plague, and pollution. Now, given these particular interlocking crises, you can see why waste would be a problem, where the plague is killing off people and the climate is making the soil unfit for the production of food, and climate change and pollution and so on make it difficult to sustain life. So under those conditions, yes, the waster would appear, in fact, to be the really, really bad guy. But waste means many things in the book. It means, for example, and this is interesting from its biblical origins, it means the removal of peoples from space, usually by God, and often with a colonial orientation towards resettling that space with better people. So there's a really interesting sort of settler colonial narrative, God's wasting the land and then more people move in and they're supposed to do better. It also indicates the misuse of spiritual resources, a squandering of material resources, trespass on the lands of others, misuse of common lands, or misappropriation by a steward of lands held for a future heir, as we heard. There are lots of figures in the book for the sin or the crime or the social misdemeanor of wasting, and that's what I'm super interested in, namely wasters, or greedy, lazy, irresponsible types who overconsume and underproduce. Sounds appealing, I don't know. These wasters grabbed my attention. So I want to lay out a little bit the typology of the waster and then investigate whether there's a potential in the waster and whether we can see them as anything other than just parasitical figures who are battening onto those good, productive people who are doing their work. And whether they can even indicate something else about these ecosystemic processes and so on. So several wasters show up in the poems that Eleanor reads with grace and forcefulness. Indeed, so smooth a reader is Eleanor that you need not to have studied the poems in her archive at all to see immediately the importance of their contributions to an account of eco-critical thought. In the chapter where she lays out her theory of waste, the laws of waste, we get our first sense that there might be some potential in this figure of the waster, rather than just an opportunity for scorn, disdain, rejection. So when God lays waste to cities, we learn, the biblical use of the term indicates a purging of wickedness and an opportunity for purification. Now, even though Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't come up much in the book, I think there's maybe one reference to it, it's hard not to think you can think of Noah if you're just a regular reader. You think of Noah's Ark and you think of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, Sodom and Gomorrah has given some language to the contemporary formulation of unnatural sexualities. So now we begin to see that wasting both can have this punitive purpose when God is doing it, but those wasters are also interesting because they are sinners of a very particular bent. So perhaps the wasters, the bad people in Sodom who engaged in unnatural sex acts and refused to offer hospitality to angels, were modeling different relations to pleasure, economy, and faith. And I'm interested whether Eleanor will allow that kind of reading. In the 13th century, wasting becomes a prerogative of the king or the lord of the manor, who can waste the lands of felons and take from those lands any resources that he likes. So here's another potential reading of the waster. But over the course of the 2 centuries that Eleanor is looking at, the definition of wasting expands and protects not only the rich from the criminal poor, but also the poor from the criminal rich. And it's a complicated process by which that happens, and it doesn't necessarily stick. But it's interesting to think about that wasting can be a good use of the commons as well as a bad use of it. So in other words, the commons, open land used by poor people as a resource, was at various times seen as waste by the church or by the landlord and then reappropriated by them. But of course, it wasn't waste to the poor people who were using it. It was, they could get wood for their houses or places for their animals to graze and so on. So there's a sense here that there might be some critique of emergent systems of privatization and capital and profit within this other understanding of wasting. And this comes to the fore in the anonymous 500-line poem from 1350, Winner and the Waster. And in my understanding of this book, that's the last poem, or that's the only poem where there's potential for the waster. Okay, so Eleanor calls this work one of the most daring ecosystemic writings of the English Middle Ages, focusing on the precarity of the land supply in England and on how imperiled land could have catastrophic downstream consequences for rich and poor alike. So what is this poem? The poem's a dream narrative about a standoff between 2 allegorical figures, a winner and a waster. And when you hear that the good guy is the winner, you begin to be worried about the opposition to the waster. Okay. Eleanor's reading makes clear that the distinct figurations of these roles actually can't hold them apart. And so while the winner wins, he also wastes. And while the waster wastes, he also wins. And so there's a really nice moral ambiguity in that poem that does not get sustained beyond that poem. The setting is a trial about waste and trespass. Winner accuses waster of mismanaging his estate and therefore wasting precious resources in a post-plague world of food precarity. Reasonable. But waster countercharges that winner is hoarding his materials and his resources and seems to propose that surplus is as much of a crime as scarcity in a world racked by contagion, soil failure, floods, and other ecological disasters. This standoff, Eleanor deftly argues, results not in the argument for one or the other, the winner or the waster, hoarding or spending, but an understanding of the interconnectedness of land, cash economies, climate, resource distribution, contagion, agriculture, and markets. So here, winning and wasting are problems unless cooperation brings them into some kind of balance. Because the winner is just keeping all his stuff for himself. He's not the redistributor of resources. The waster is, at least the waster is eating the food, okay? The winner is not even eating it. So there are other problems than wasting, and that poem seems to intimate this. Of course, winning, Eleanor gives us this reading really and says, this is a poem in which wasting may be necessary, in which we might need wasters to make the economy function, end quote. Now, of course, winning by the same logic is not an unquestionable good. It can name a selfish attempt to amass resources for the wealth of the individual rather than the society of the whole. And that's the same as the landlord who says to the people who are using the commons, this land is wasted, let's plant it. But the people who are using it as the commons have not been wasting the land. So this privatization attached to the winner seems like a problem, as does the idea that we have to waste these bad, unproductive people who are also attached to unnatural sexuality. All right, I'm not a medieval scholar, no surprise there, and I have not read closely the poems about which Eleanor writes, but it seems to me that apart from this poem's moral ambiguity, the rest of the archive on waste comes down heavily on the side of the winner. The other wasters are condemned outright, as Eleanor shows. And so the poet who wrote Piers Plowman, William Langland, quote, seems eager to condemn waste and gives us gluttons and sloths rather than articulate spokesman for either the spending or the redistributing of resources. And like Brooke, I was really taken with the sweaty yeoman in the canon's Yeoman's Tale. And there is something sort of salacious in the fact that the two of them run up sweating to the party, come late, the two of them together, you know, having been engaged in some secret activity of which the canon seems to be very embarrassed. He is extremely ashamed when his yeoman makes it clear what they've been doing. So the two sweaty men arrive late to the party. I don't know. This sounds interesting to me. And so here we get the yeoman, an alchemist who is both wasting away from his unnatural activities, and also wasting his time and energies in this disreputable pursuit of turning lead into gold. The canon and his yeoman come late to the party, sweaty and poorly dressed, and are cast in every way as being fakes, counterfeiters, and shameful addicts of some kind that we can't name. They're irredeemable, corrupt, and possibly sexually unnatural. But there are more very sexually unnatural figures who are associated with waste. Sir Gawain is also a figure for waste in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He challenges the Green Knight, beheads him. There's much beheading in this narrative that seems to make no difference. People just put the head under their arm, off they go. There are jokes to be made about heads in there that I won't go to. But Eleanor, I think, really cleverly turns the Green Knight into a kind of marvelous figure for nature itself and its ability to absorb the human. That's fine, but there is, remember, that whole homoerotic part to that story where Sir Gawain has to keep giving kisses to the Lord of the Manor because the wife has given him kisses. He has to return whatever he receives to the Lord. And so there are endless sort of exchanges between the two men and the wife. So the Green Knight might be nature itself, but he's also a figure of a kind of extravagant sexuality, a sodomitical figure of prosthetic body parts that come off and then can be put back on. He loses his head, the knight does, and picks it back up. They both have these sort of outsized desires. In other words, and I'm working up to my conclusion, within all this louche, unproductive wasting, what discourses on pleasure, on leisure, on mutual exchange, on sodomitical, non-reproductive sex lurk? What perverse and sweaty narratives and desires adhere to the ornate, and to use Eleanor's word, lurchy narratives of the wasters? Can we discern practices and predilections in the category of wasting that oppose work on the one hand, mandatory productivity, expropriation, and obligatory reproduction on the other? So we have anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and queerness all embedded into the category of the waster. Eleanor's proposal at the end of the book is that, to misquote Bruno Latour, perhaps we have always been medieval, in the sense that the medieval sense of the world as an interdependent mesh of ecosystems, or in her terms, an integrated ecology, is still the better way of thinking about the embeddedness of humans in sprawling ecological systems. I love this sense of embeddedness and accountability, but I wonder if it lets capitalism off the hook a little. Perhaps waste is not always the problem, in the sense that a parsimonious orientation to resources favored by the winners sets up a logic that both requires and punishes losers, wasters, extravagant counterfeiters, and knights who play with each other's axes. I'm not saying that wasters are proto-homosexuals, but the homoerotics of the various scenarios of wasting, from Sodom and Gomorrah to sweaty yeomen and sweaty shamed canons, suggest another trajectory for waste, the wasting of male seed, which is an old sore of homophobia that emerges in the 19th century as the theological argument against non-procreative sexuality. So 3 questions by way of conclusion. What is the role of pleasure? It's way more pleasurable to waste and eat all the food than it is to save it and starve, okay, and do all the work. So what is the role of pleasure? Hunger obviously is not seen by us just as a wasting force. It's also a metaphor for desire. And gluttony names, as much as it's a kind of greedy, an unpleasant greediness, it's also about excessive interest in pleasure. So can we find alternative systems of desire in this standoff between the wasters and the winners? Second, it's hard not to read this book as a person who has lived it all in the 20th century and not think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right? And I kept waiting for that moment because I see the poem really differently now, having read your book, Eleanor, and I just want to ask you to bridge the gap for us. He also sees waste as place, waste as land, and wasteland as a consequence of excess and poor stewardship. But of course, the poem is also deeply invested and interested in the broken self, the anxious, disordered body, and the horror of ecological disaster. How did we get there from your set of interests and archives? And then just finally, what about bodily fluids in this medieval language? There's just a lot of fluids. A lot of different sexual economies. I'll end there. Thank you.
Before turning to the wonderfulness of this book, I want to begin with the wonderfulness of Eleanor herself. Even before I arrived at Columbia, Eleanor had already volunteered to read my work. In my years here, she has continued to read it, and her feedback has been consistently brilliant and incisive. She has also been my greatest mentor, and I can safely say that because there's nobody from the French department here. She has shared her review statements with me and read multiple drafts of mine, and she has consistently given me excellent advice on navigating Columbia as an institution. And I know the same is true of many of my untenured colleagues. I'm profoundly in her debt, and I just wanted to publicly acknowledge the fantastic amounts of work that she has done for me, because that kind of peer review and mentoring is so often invisible. Now to the book. I might begin by drawing attention to Eleanor's staggering array of sources in this book. In legal and historical documents, in penitential manuals and in sermons, in the Bible and in 14th century English literature, Eleanor seems miraculously equally at ease. I am most excited, however, about what Eleanor does with form. Here, as in many of her other writings, Eleanor makes a compelling case for the paramount role of form. She draws attention to the specific affordances of literature, not just thematically, but also formally, in cultivating what we might call an ecosystemic awareness, an awareness of the ways in which we are inseparable from our environment. And it's interesting that we've all come to the same spot in your book. For me, the high point of the book was her analysis of Chaucer's Yeoman's Tale and her case for what she calls the yeoman's wasting words. Chaucer unusually deviates from his typical stress pattern in this tale, including a proliferation of hypo and hypermetric lines that other scholars consider, so much so that other scholars consider the text to be inauthentic. Eleanor brilliantly links this formal experimentation to waste, even showing how we as readers are put on trial. If we read them too quickly, we evacuate the poetry of its referential content, and in this sense, we waste it. It becomes fruitless, valueless, because we have not extracted from it what we should. If, however, we take the opposite approach and read the lines too slowly, we overconsume them. We hear them only as noise, as pure sound, no meaning. This too is a kind of waste. This is a characteristically Johnsonian, if you will, showcasing of the ethical stakes of form. I have never been excited about a hypometric line before.
And Eleanor manages to spark this excitement in a piece of scholarship that is, as others have said, truly written for a general audience. This is the most readable piece of academic prose that I've ever encountered. I applaud Eleanor for her remarkable clarity, and I hope that the book reaches the broad audience that she intends. I could continue to enumerate the ways in which the book is fantastic, but I'm sure we'd all rather hear from Eleanor, so I'll cut to my 3 questions, which are all very flat-footed. The first is essentially about class. I'm interested in class as it manifests in the legal and historical documents that you discuss on the one hand, versus how it manifests in your literary corpus. And it seems to me that those are 2 very different manifestations, actually, and correct me if I'm wrong. The 2 trends you discuss in chapter 1, and here I learned some new words, asserting and afforestation would have affected mostly the poor. It was the upper classes who were doing the asserting and afforestation. In the former, a wealthy landlord took over lands that were previously commonly held, and in the latter, land was sequestered for the crown. These trends both involve privatization and benefit the upper classes at the expense of the lower, obviously. Curiously, though, in the literary texts you discuss, and it may be because I haven't read them in 20 years or so, there's a strange indifference to class, and waste seems to affect everyone equally. About winner and waster, you say that the text focuses on, quote, how the imperiled land could have catastrophic downstream consequences for the rich and the poor alike. And that's page 69. The only characters you mention in your text who don't seem to be landowners, and I may be wrong about this, are Will and Piers Plowman and the gardener in chapter 8, where there is, as you point out, a conspicuous and fantasized absence of a, quote, profiteering aristocracy. But where is the profiteering aristocracy in the rest of your texts? Would you agree that these literary texts are indifferent to class, or at the very least that they disavow the disproportionate effects of environmental change on the lower classes? If so, why? What is at stake ideologically? Question 2, where are the women? They don't seem to be the key players, at least as concerns the concept of waste in the text that you discuss. Does this have something to do with their legal rights? And I confess that I'm not a property law nerd in the way that you are. Could they be landholders in 14th century England? Did the Black Death change anything with respect to women's property rights? Can they not be wasters because they cannot be landowners, if this is in fact true? Why are they absent? And I ask this in part because I looked up gâte in the Dictionary of Middle French, and it has one meaning that is specific to women, and Eleanor's nodding, she clearly knows this. As an adjective, it can mean either violated or sexually promiscuous. So this seems to encompass the 2 principal meanings in your corpus. A woman's body can be like a wasted land, and a woman can be also a waster in dispensing of her body too freely. But that seems to be her only resource. Question 3. Basically, I'm interested in alternative modes of ecological thought. In 14th century England, the authors you discuss all seem to have very similar eco-politics. Is there a countercurrent somewhere? More narrowly, I was thinking about green man iconography, particularly when I was reading your Sir Gawain chapter and also the discussion of the yeoman. And if I'm not mistaken, green man iconography becomes especially prominent in Gothic art. And it's also a much more frightening manifestation of what you call the interimplication of the human within a broader ecosystem. Vegetation seems to take over the human, and it especially compromises the human sensorial faculties, right? The vegetation is growing out of all of the orifices of the face. So how would you see the green man in relation to waste? Is this a different vision of entanglement from the one that you offer in the book? And is it complementary or opposed to it?
Sorry. So first of all, thank you very much, you guys. I'm now officially having a really good day. Thank you for all your extremely insightful engagements with my work and all the lovely things you said about me and my scholarship. I'm profoundly honored beyond my capacity to express. So I'll just say again, thank you so much for all being here and reading. So many exciting questions. I have so much to say, and I'm going to have a little bit of a hard time organizing my thoughts, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So I think I can partially address some of what Jack was asking and some of what Brooke was asking together. I'll also via the Canon's Yeoman. And let me just say, those of you in the room who are in my Canterbury Tales class, what's my favorite Canterbury Tales? Canon's Yeoman. So I'm like really happy that everyone's gravitated toward that chapter. He's like my special friend. So I'm pleased as punch that we're kind of landing there. So what I think I would say is both sort of to you, Jack, and to you, Brooke, about the Canon's Yeoman's Tale is that I think that the pleasure principle creeps into the logic of waste through language and through poetry. Like I read Chaucer's metrical experimentation in the Canon's Yeoman's Tale as like the absolute singing virtuosic high watermark of his entire career. When I imagine Chaucer writing this thing, I think he was having the best day of his life, right? Because he was like, look what I'm doing with this poetry. I just spent like a gajillion lines doing rhymed couplets with 5 stresses a piece. And now I'm going to experiment with like a 3 stress line and then a 7 stress line and then a 6 stress line and then a 5 stress line. And I'm just going to see how much stress, I meant that metaphorically, but also poetically, how much tension I can put into the poetic line and have the thing still hang together. So I think that the moment at which we really in that text can say that waste embodies a dynamic of pleasure is in the metapoetic moment, where like the language itself is like doing the real alchemy, right? Like transforming the base lead, as it were, of language into something actually golden, so that it's in language and not the material world that you can find like a redemptive, a compounding of value that's not capitalistic, put it that way, and that's very pleasure centered. So that's mostly to Jack, but relatedly to Brooke, when you were saying, you know, asking me to say more about the material dimensions and the crisis of the commons then and now, and about, you know, how the wasting body and the Canon's Yeoman, all of these kind of intersect. I guess what I'd say there is I think that the tragedy of the commons then and now just have an enormous amount to say to each other, right? Like the ideal, just for those of you who may not know, conventionally, it's been said that, you know, the tragedy of the commons, which is when commonly held property in Europe and in particular in England, the tragedy of the commons happens when people start to enclose and privatize land. And usually that's said to happen kind of in the early modern period. That's not right. It happens in the Middle Ages and it happens a lot and really fast and everyone is bugging out about it. And so one of the things that happens, and this is a passage that Jack was alluding to before, there are these really great scenes of where, you know, you do root for the waster, where waste is kind of the hero, where, for example, poor people will go in. This is an actual case that survives in the archive. And this is why reading medieval case law is so fun. So this group of peasants in this town go into the wasteland, which had been privatized by a local landlord. Why would you privatize a wasteland, you may ask? Because acre per acre, wasteland was more valuable than any other kind of land, because what you can harvest out of the wasteland is peat, which is the most valuable fuel commodity, which, like in pre-industrial England, it was very cold in the winter. You needed to burn peat to not die, right? So peat harvesting, very valuable, and mast, which is like this acorny, nutrient-dense nut stuff that would be on the ground that you fed your pigs to over the winter. So basically, if you and your animals want to make it through the winter, you have to have access to the wasteland. The wastelands are not wastes. They are extremely productive lands. And the poor people are painfully, acutely aware of that. And so are the landlords. So the landlords would enclose the wastelands and then strip out all the peat and sell the peat at high prices. So the local people don't like that very much. So there's this one instance where the local peasants go into the wastelands and lay waste to it. So they like strip out all the peat and they take it away. And when the landlord takes them to court, he says, hey, they wasted my wastes. And people are like, yeah, see that? That's because the shit is valuable and we have like a historical right to participate in it. We didn't break the law. We exercise our historical right to take value from the commons. And the judge was basically like, I don't know what to do here, because they have a point and so does the landowner. And so you see in this like really interesting way that sometimes the wasters are these like renegade, anti-capitalist, anti-privatization agents who are merely claiming that, like, in fact, all of the land is valuable and we should all have access to it. So there is like a counter narrative where sometimes the wasters are the good guys. And I think the Canon's Yeoman participates in that. Sorry, to get back to Brooke again. You were talking a little bit about the shift from wasting in an agricultural setting to like the alchemical waste. This is one of my favorite moments in the trajectory of the book, because early on, like, which is to say from about 1350 to about 1388, the poetic texts really are primarily concerned with how waste takes place in the land. And then you get Chaucer, who really likes to mess stuff up. And he comes in and he says, oh, what about waste in an urban setting? What does it look like to have waste in a city? And he takes the Canon's Yeoman and the Canon, who do show up very late and very sweaty. And I think you can read that queer. And the text is like obsessive about it. Like there's all this discussion about like, oh, the Canon was so sweaty that his sweat soaked through the burdock leaf packing that he put into his hat to help soak up the sweat that was already running down his face. So he's not trivially sweaty. And the horse is sweating that they rode in on. Like it's not there. And I think though that part of what all that energy is thinking about is like what happens when you displace this anxiety about how all of us participating in some kind of socioeconomic totality together, you displace that from the land and from the agricultural world into the city, where like I can't like lay waste to your property in the city because you don't have property. You have just the house that you live in. You don't have land. So how am I going to hurt you with my like ecosystemic choices in the city? And Chaucer's answer through the Yeoman is I'm going to hurt you by doing things that are polluting, by things that are contagious. And the Canon's Yeoman's Tale is really the moment when Chaucer's thinking through plague trauma, right? And so plague, obviously, of the 5 catastrophes that Jack alluded to and that the book kind of takes on, which is, you know, loss of arable land, famine, climate change, plague, and pollution. Plague is actually by far the most catastrophic loss of human life in the 14th century. And just to give you some statistics, in 1347-48, a third of the population of England died. There are cities where in 1348, the population went from 20,000 to 6,000. I mean, catastrophic loss of human life. So it's weird that there's not like a lot of plague literature in medieval, but there's not a lot of plague literature in medieval England. There's a lot in France, there's a lot in Italy, there's not a lot in medieval England. And I think it has something to do with the fact that the trauma was so severe that the poets are still kind of like trying to come to terms with what it is to live in a world where your next door neighbor might come over and make you sick so that you die and your whole family dies, and it all happens in like 2 or 3 days. Like very, very frightening stuff. And Chaucer's meditations on alchemy are, and he uses this word repeatedly in the Canon's Yeoman's Tale, about infection. He talks about how alchemy can infect a la tune, which is to say can infect an entire city. Can it? Like, can alchemy like actually infect a whole town? No, it cannot. Alchemy is a thought. It is a practice of scientific inquiry. It is a proto-empirical science. It can't be contagious. So it's like a metaphor. Chaucer's thinking through plague using alchemy. And, you know, I think that in the medieval ideology around disease and contagion, there's almost always like a moral underbelly to that. And I think that part of what Chaucer might be getting at with all this like angsting about these 2 men, queer bodies, very sweaty, is this idea that like something counter-capitalistic and maybe queer might also be like catching. So I think that there's some real deep anxiety in there too. And I think that's part of what Chaucer kind of picks up when he shifts our attention from the agricultural scene to the urban scene. I will also now move forward to talk a little bit about another point that Jack made about that winter is sometimes a bad guy. This too relates to plague. That's right. And this is one of the things I enjoyed very much about reading these texts. These texts are all really, really opposed to hoarding. They're really opposed to the idea that you should get some money and then get more and more and more and more and more. Winter is a bad guy. He's a bad guy in that poem. In Winter and Waster, Winter is a bad guy. Waster's like a problem. He's like a shifty character who sometimes acts in a selfish manner, but ultimately he wants to redistribute wealth. That's his whole claim. He says, what'll happen if nobody spends money? The poor won't eat. Like if I don't spend my money, the poor won't eat. It's basically like a trickle-down economics kind of theory of economic redistribution. And Winter's like, no, we have to keep all of the good things trapped in a chest. He's the bad guy. And if you look at medieval literature, particularly in the wake of the famines of the 1310s, 1330s, and then the plague, There is no social practice that is more universally hated than hoarding, because people were starving to death in medieval England. So there's a statistic that between about 1310 and 1330, which is like one generation before these poems are written, 10% of the population of England died of starvation. Now, if that's true or even close to true, probably you're talking about 60 to 80% of people who are in severe food deserts, right? Severe constrained food situations. And so Winner, this guy who like wants to hoard resources, he's a really bad guy. And so that is definitely kind of a vote for waster. So waste is kind of the arch sin in many, many ways in this text, in my book and in the argument. But there is this counter discourse in which waster is in part like a way of thinking about distributing goods more equitably. And in terms of like the overall ethos of the writers kind of across the board, they are all interested in this idea of the redistribution of wealth. And I think one of the things that I learned from doing this work is that for these medieval thinkers, ecosystemic entanglement is always also socioeconomic entanglement. They're very, very aware that when you harm the land, you are harming somebody else's ability to put food on the table. And not just because there's less food, but also because you mess with the money economy in a pretty significant way. So there's this deep awareness throughout these texts that you have to figure out ways to redistribute wealth more equitably. You can't have hoarders, and you actually can't have people who just consume and consume and consume either. Both are bad. There has to be a way to make sure that everyone has enough of something, this kind of redistribution principle. So turning now to some of Eliza's questions. First of all, thank you for what you said about hypermetrical lines. That's like literally my favorite thing in the Canterbury Tales. So you were asking about class and talking about how starting and afforestation mainly affected the poor. And in the literary text, there's the sort of like, you said, a strange indifference to class, and waste seems to affect everyone equally. I think that's really right. And I think the way that that makes sense is if you look at the way the law of waste evolves over the course of the 14th century, it goes from being primarily, and Jack sort of alluded to this too, about, you know, a practice that does most adversely affect the poor to a practice that affects everybody. So even the law becomes aware that like marketplace acts of waste are still damaging, and they're damaging for everyone. So one of the reasons I think that the poets kind of glom on to the idea of waste is it's a socioeconomic and ecosystemic practice that I can embody, me myself, and I will unwittingly and unintentionally affect every single person around me, irrespective of class, irrespective of everything. As of the question, where are the women? There are women who are accused of waste. There are actually some in the Canterbury Tales. Almost always, not every single time, almost always they're accused of misusing their husband's resources, which is, I think, like actually kind of a really cool refiguration of the idea of proxy misallocation of wealth, right? Because like anything that the woman has access to as a married woman, as a wife, is something she holds notionally for the benefit of the person who owns it, which is her husband. So women get dinged for waste a lot in being bad managers of the household. That happens a lot. There are not any poems that I've read in England that are like really centrally about that, but it comes up a lot, kind of like as a comment in passing, sort of throughout many tales, including the Canterbury Tales. Okay. Oh yeah, and in terms of, is there another ecosystemic discourse or a countercurrent other than this one of wasting, like green man iconography? Yes, definitely. Susan Crane has like a really wonderful book on interspecies contact. And I would put the green man tradition as a version of that, right? Where there's this like ontological pour over. So another main thread of ecological thought in this period is precisely thought about how extremely porous and elastic ontological categories and boundaries are, so that like a person is not, you can't like be sure that you're going to wake up every morning of your life and be a person, and you can't be sure that your dog is going to wake up every morning of your dog's life and continue to be a dog. There's some degree of ontological elasticity that transcends species, and even like, you know, what's that large, oh my God, term? The difference between plants and animals is kingdom, like biological kingdoms, right? And I would say that sort of, there are whispers of that in my project, even though I'm centered on waste. Like the beekeeping stuff is very much about that the bees are people and the people are bees. And, you know, as you rightly point out, like Gawain in the Green Knight is kind of another instance of that, where the Green Man clearly both is a man and is like an enchanted, perfect figuration of nature's capacity to consume its like unruly, shitty children in the form of human beings and the cultures that they try to create. So some of that is in here, but the sort of like radical instability of personhood, that is elsewhere also, not just in waste text, but that comes up kind of all over the place in the medieval literary archive. Maybe I should stop there and take questions. Is that appropriate now? Okay. Thank you guys so much. That was really. Julie.
I was waiting for other people first, but I have so many things to observe and think. But just one thing I was thinking about, this is going to seem totally off topic, about 19th century prisons, where the worst punishment was treadmills that didn't do anything, shot drill that didn't do anything. So part of the punishment was to waste the spirit and the energy of the incarcerated. And while actually being perfectly, content with making the prison a place of waste that didn't, waste bodies. Ontological elasticity.
Yes.
I've been thinking a lot about and reading a lot about indigenous efforts to sort of appropriate the idea that corporations are persons by making rivers have legal personality or mountains have legal personality. And I will say that I have some ambivalence about this, because it seems to me often a kind of projection that kind of skips over the waste that all these corporations are doing to people as well as to the environment that affects people. And so I guess turning it into a question, I was thinking, is there a medieval discourse of, the personhood of natural things? And are those natural things that sort of stand for waste in the sense that they're not doing anything, they're just being there? Or is the idea that you are a waster if you somehow do depredations on these things? Or it's kind of vaguely formed, but you will have a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for your questions. I have several thoughts. I guess first one, if I may respond to the prison thing, that's fascinating to me, right? Because the idea that people are punished by being made to do something with their body that is futile, that presupposes that even an imprisoned person would be sort of psychologically tortured by being made to do non-productive labor, which would suggest that the ideology of waste that's emerging here, where wasting your time is like a really bad situation to find yourself in, has gained so much cultural traction by 400, 500 years later, that you can use it as a mode of torture. That's really, really interesting to me, that like people could be tormented in prison by being forced to waste their bodies and waste their time. So the question about nature, I mean, the reality is that there are, and this actually I could have said to Eliza too, for other sort of currents of nature philosophy in the period, there's a lot of medieval poems that just personify nature, like a bunch of them. Some of them are really great and interesting, and some of them are not. One of my favorite ones is the Cosmographia of Bernard of Silvestris. He's fantastic. And for him, nature is like quite cranky, cantankerous, like beleaguered. And waste isn't like a central term for Bernard, but there's this idea that nature is harmable, right? As soon as you turn nature into a person, you're presupposing that you could injure nature, right? Because people are vulnerable, and that's part of why personification is an interesting form. So there's quite a lot of discourse about nature as subject to injury, subject to harm, subject to degradation, that often happens in the realm of personification discourse. Does that answer your question, or do you want me to say a little bit more about it? Yeah. Okay.
Can I make a really, like, something I noticed, or I'm not on the thing, but I was noticing nature is on the side, right? So nature comes out in Gowan and the Green Knight, but you center waste as the main way to get into ecosystemic. And I was just, I don't want to take another question, but I just wanted to make that observation, because it is striking given the prevalence of nature in other ways of thinking about ecosystemic thought in the medieval world.
Yeah. part of the reason that I did that is that I think once you come to medieval literature with the idea that you know what nature is, things seem more settled than they actually are. So like the goddess Natura shows up all over the place, but she doesn't necessarily entail the kind of ideology of ecosystemic interimplication that you find in the discourse on waste. She's often a more kind of distantiated, abstracted figure who is capable of being hurt, but she's kind of like imperiously kind of pontificating about X, Y, and Z rather than, being some kind of like really active, engaged social interlocutor. And so I wanted to look deliberately away from that discourse. Just think about ecosystemic thought in this period. Christine?
Hi, thank you. So I'm thinking in hearing about your book, about the conversations that you and I have had about, for instance, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as a horror narrative,
Yes.
but also about the sort of comedic bent maybe to the Canyon's Yeoman's situation. I'm wondering about the like affective or emotional disposition that the poets you're working with have towards waste. And is
That's
there
a
a
great
range
question.
of those or yeah?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the short answer is yes, there's a range. The slightly longer answer is even within a given work, there's some play around the affect we're supposed to feel. I do feel strongly that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, its ecosystemic meditations should be thought of as horror, right? There's this idea that no matter what we do, eventually the like creeping, terrifying green will overtake everything that we are, so that when we look around for a green chapel from the past, what you find is like a hill with like a kind of a vague door in one side, because in fact, all cultures are eventually overtaken by nature. And I do think that the text means that to be deeply, deeply, deeply scary. And I honestly think that, the Gawain poet more largely in the manuscript that work is in, is sort of systematically interested in horror as an affect state and sometimes talks very explicitly about it in the poems Cleanness and Patience. So I think horror is like bang on for that work. It's not the only thing that's happening, but it's a really, really central thing that's happening. The Canon's Yeoman's Tale, I think, is also partially about horror, but almost horror as it edges over into camp. So, and as you know from prior conversations we've had, horror and comedy are kissing cousins, right? They're like very proximal discourses and affect states. So I think we're supposed to feel like sort of scandalized and horrified by the yeoman, but also like quite titillated and interested, right? And this again gets back to Jack, this sort of like queer desire dynamic. Like, who doesn't want to know how to do alchemy? I want to know. I definitely would love to know how it works. And the text is structured to keep us constantly like rolling through the next list of ingredients and trying to come to certainty. And then it never happens. So we're kind of left in this stasis of like semi-amused desire, even though, like, again, as I said, I think part of the trauma that's being processed in that narrative is plague. And in that sense, it's a horror narrative of sorts as well. So I think the affect does vary a lot work to work. Honestly, I think the scariest narrative in this book, and by the way, the horror subtext is like partially why I chose that cover design, but Langland is definitely a horror writer, right? Never gets talked about that way. But the fact that, so there's a section of Piers Plowman when everybody's wasting and Waster's kind of taking over and he's like pigging out and refusing to work and it all sucks. And Piers Plowman, who's like notionally the hero of the poem, is like, nobody's producing. Everyone's just like consuming and nobody's producing. How am I going to get everybody in line? I know what I'll do. I'll go call hunger to come. And hunger for sure has to do in part with desire, but hunger in Middle English really means like famine. So Piers Plowman like invites famine to come bring people to heal. That's really scary, right? And this is a poem written in a moment when like 10% of the population had died of hunger. I am very pleased to say that probably no one in this room knows what it might feel like to be under that level of food stress, where 1 in 10 people that you know have starved to death. Okay, so to have a poem that takes seriously the idea that its own hero, Piers Plowman, who's like the best guy in the poem, would get so frustrated with how bad and poorly behaved we are that he would invite famine to come and play the role of disciplinarian. That's a scary story. So horror is like a fairly, not pervasive, but a pretty consistent affective dynamic in these works. The huge exception is Mum and the Sausage, which is like very cheerful by comparison with everything else. Thank you for your question. Hi, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, I immediately thought of what we're doing in Lit Hum, like specifically in the Old Testament, and the idea of Joseph hoarding or keeping track of all of the grain and food for the famine spell in Egypt, but then also the idea of wealth redistribution and like the worst thing in the world being that hoarding of resources in the Gospels. So I was wondering if there was like a specific, I'm sure you talk about this in the book, but like political or religious rhetoric towards either saying like our religion is the best because we condemn the wasters, or saying like this religion is bad because they are wasters.
I think that, in the Joseph section of the Hebrew Bible, I wouldn't classify what he does as hoarding so much as provisioning. And there's hoarding is when you keep it all for yourself and never consume it. He sees the famine coming and like basically makes it so that food wealth can be distributed to everyone when the famine comes. So in effect, he's like the best possible steward. You're thinking ahead to the parable of the steward from Luke. Yeah. So he's like the paragon steward. He like sees the famine coming before it's there. He preps, he collects goods, and then he's going to redistribute them when the famine comes. The parable of the unjust steward is more like that's the sort of Luke-y response to that kind of dynamic, and saying, anyone who mismanages resources is like the arch sinner, right? Because a famine will come and you need to be able to distribute the wealth in the way that Joseph does. And for sure, and this is central to the third chapter, the parable of the unjust steward is like a big, big feature in that chapter. And the idea is essentially that, medieval theorists of waste are painfully aware of that in Luke, the parable of the unjust steward is not about like, it's not just about the steward getting fired for mismanaging God's goods, which sadly is often where contemporary exegesis of that narrative stops. It's really about him getting back into good graces with the Lord by redistributing wealth, as we kind of talked about in class. So I think that both in the Hebraic tradition and in the Christian, or like I'll say Luke's follow-up to that tradition, there's this very strong emphasis on essentially provisioning, right? On using not even using, safeguarding resources so that in times of shortage, you can do something that distributes wealth to everyone.
Thank you, Professor Johnson, and also the panelists for such a stimulating discussion and series of presentations. The comments about wasting one's time and wasting one's talents just sort of inspired a question, and it could be really well-worn ground. How does the idea of purgatory figure, if at all, in the thinking, the ecosystemic thought of some of the texts you're working with? Whether purgatory as a place, or purgatory as it figures in the spiritual economy and also the economy of the material world?
Great question. So I don't really talk at all about purgatory in this book, but I do talk a lot about purgation, which of course is like what purgatory in principle is about. And, essentially in biblical discourse, the context that waste comes up in, and Jack talked about this a little bit, is that God lays waste to people who are misbehaving. So waste, before it gets criminalized in the English positive law, starting with Magna Carta, before waste is criminalized, is understood as like a licit privilege of God or the king, which is done in order to purge and punish like a sinful people or like a particular sinful citizen. And the idea is that, essentially by wasting, you're like stripping out all that's bad from the land, including its prior owners, and you're getting it ready for some kind of better thing to come in. So waste and purgation definitely have a strong explicit relationship in my text. Your question though about purgatory, I don't talk about that in the text, but there's a few things I'll say. One of the ideological shifts that happens in Latin uses of waste, which is vastare, the verb vastare, is that over the course of late antiquity, so post the Hebrew Bible and also post the Gospels, in the sort of commentary tradition that rises up on, in particular, the Christian Gospels, is this conversation about how when wasting is happening, what we should commentaries on the Hebrew part of the Bible by Christians. What we should understand by God's wasting is that God is not just literally wasting historical lands of bad peoples. He's also wasting the soul of sin. And waste, vastare in Latin, it's evaporative. It has an evaporative sense. So you're both emptying people out of land and you're actually like burning off sin from the soul. And there's a lot of commentaries that use that fire burning purgative metaphoric to talk about what God does to the soul. And in that sense, like, essentially wasting is about purgatory. It is about the purgation of the soul of sin, which is like what's supposed to happen in purgatory. A really interesting thing to do after you know that is to look at Dante and say, like, what the hell, man? Like, why do you make purgatory this weird foggy place? It's like the least burny place. It's like gray and foggy and unnavigable and slow and weird and kind of stuck. It seems to me like Dante is, if anything, like critiquing this idea that purgatory should be a place of the wasting off of sin. For him, it's much more like you have to clock a certain number of hours there and then you get out. It's not this despoliative theory of purgatory, even though that's like heavily attested in late antique commentaries. Does that answer your question? Okay. Hi, Grant.
Hello. So obviously Piers Plowman wants us to be very productive.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, and keeping in mind, like, the peat case that you were discussing,
Yeah.
Peat famously does not come back very quickly once you harvest it.
Right.
It takes a while to build up.
Mhm.
So what do the texts have to say about like overproduction of stuff that is good? Getting peat to keep your house warm is good, but you can take too much of it. So like, where does that come in?
In a lot of different places. It's a very good question. So I think I would answer that by doing really, really quick, slightly deeper dive into the food situation in the 14th century. So very briefly, in the 14th century, you have horrible, horrible periods of rain, very, very long winters, 1310s, 1320s, really acutely in the 1330s. And it totally, it like destroyed agricultural productivity to such an extent that like whole towns were abandoned because they were just in water for like a whole growing season. So people like abandoned towns. There's like flood narratives everywhere. The animals got ruminant diseases like rinderpest, which has to do with the animals' hooves being in sodden like liquid for too long, and then the animals are dying off. So there's this like really massive loss of resources. Land is gone, the animals are gone, the peat is all sodden, the peat's getting used up, and everyone is very aware that like if you are overusing the resources, it's a bigger problem than before because there's already a restriction on resources that has to do essentially with climate change, which medieval people fully recognized was happening, right? I get asked this question a lot. Oh, you're saying there's like climate change in the Middle Ages, but like how aware were medieval people of climate change? And the answer is extremely aware. If it rains until May every year of your life, and your parents are like, oh, May used to be sunny, you're aware that the climate has changed. And one of my big aha moments in writing this book was about the opening 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales. Juan that April with his shorta soja. You write that line when you've never seen April be that nice, right? Why does Chaucer perseverate on this awesome April? It's because April is usually a disaster in this period in medieval England. Like April was still wintertime. So this is a culture that's like pervasively aware of the extreme vulnerability of resources. And so people are very worried about people overusing peat. Let me rephrase that. People are very worried about privatizers overusing peat, overusing coal, overusing fish. There's a lot of sensitivity to the overfishing in these periods of shortage. Because what do you do when your manor house goes from having like 48 head of livestock to 2? And that happened in the Ramsey Manor, that number, 48 to 2 over the course of a year. That's a huge loss of food. Well, you fish. But if everyone has the same great idea at the same time, and then the fish run out, you have a really big problem. And that happened. So people were seeing that there's a limit on the yield of nature. Nature had like a level of productivity and a level of sustenance above which it can't go, right? And that was very, very scary for people. And I think that that's part of what triggered Langland to like write this like extremely anxious horror narrative about waste, because he's aware that, at a certain point you consume and there's actually nothing left, right? At some point, wasting turns into the wasteland, not in the sense of like the agricultural waste that has mast and peat, but in the biblical sense of actual devastation and total despoliation. Yeah. Oh, yes. Good question. I don't know what to say about Elliot. I mean, did you have anything else you wanted me to?
Just seems so.
It seems now that I've read your book, I'm like, well, why wouldn't we read The Wasteland back
Mhm.
through this set of allusions? And then the fact that Eliot is borrowing Chaucer in his opening
Mhm.
line suggests that he's also suggesting that there's a connection there. But clearly it's going to narrate a big shift
Mhm.
from the way that waste has operated in your works to
Mhm.
this very modern individuated
Yeah.
use of the wasting of life, I guess,
Mhm.
the wasting of the self.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think one of the differences and one of the ways in which Eliot, to the extent that he might be engaged with this corpus or with this like idea at some level, one of the things he's doing that's sort of revisionist is one of the thrusts of all of the works that I read in here is to kind of try and urge us to think of our individual self as somewhat illusory, right? Really, we exist in collectivity. We exist in relationality to other people, kind of at all points. And when you start to think like, oh, I deserve more, you're actually like violating the way in which you exist in the world, right? Because the way in which you exist in the world is in relation to other people, mediated through resources, which include land, money, movable goods, words, intentions, thoughts, bodies, energy, love, affect, all of these things. And I think for Eliot, the crisis comes when the like actual boundaries of the self are really kind of crumbling kind of into nothing, whereas the medieval writers want the boundaries of the self to crumble into a whole, right? Not an HOLE, a WHOLE, into like a totality, a collective participation. So I think that might be like a kind of revisionism that's at work there. And okay. Thank you all.
Please join me in thanking